Well, now, folks, today we're talking about something a little different. Something that a lot of people might not know much about. But trust me, it's a story worth telling. You see, back in World War II, there was a group of women who took to the skies and proved once and for all that courage and grit ain't reserved for just the menfolk. This here is the story of the Women Airforce Service Pilots, better known as the WASP. And let me tell you, their tale is something that'll make you stand a little taller, maybe even wipe a tear from your eye. So buckle up, sit back, and let's talk about the women who changed the skies forever.
My sister and I remember still a tulip garden by an old Dutch mill, and the home that was all our own but we don't talk about that. My sister and I recall once more the fishing schooners pulling into shore, and the dog cart we drove in.
Before we continue, I'd love to introduce Valerie Scott with the Devil Dog Squadron as our WASP insider for this video.
So my name is Valerie Scott. I became a pilot in 1978, and then flew for corporate, did some flight instruction, 3 different airlines, ended my career with a major airline in May of 21. And I started flying with the Commemorative Air Force in 2017 when I discovered the Devil Dog. I had moved from Colorado to Texas and discovered the aircraft at the local airport close by me. And in the process, when I moved from Colorado to Texas, I was aware of the WASP, and I even tried to go by the museum on the way to Texas, but unfortunately they were closed that day. But then starting in 2017, I did attend their homecoming and have gone several years on several occasions and met several of the ladies. It's been quite an honor.
Now, if y'all think back to the 1940s, America was smack dab in the middle of World War II. The men were heading off to fight, and the factories were running day and night, cranking out planes, tanks, and all firepower needed to win the war. But there was one big problem: a low amount of pilots.
Some of the factors that led to the creation, there was a need for pilots.
The Army Air Corps was in a real bind. They needed more pilots to ferry planes, test aircraft, and handle the jobs that kept the war machine running.
So it wasn't until 1942, and actually I think that, when they formally revisited, those officers then recalled, once they had such huge losses overseas and they were losing so many pilots, and they had a critical shortage then, they were building so many aircraft, they needed to get them from the factories to the air bases all over the country, and saw this as an opportunity to utilize the women in this way.
But back then, women weren't exactly the first folks you thought of when it came to flying military aircraft. Matter of fact, most people figured a woman's place was anywhere but a cockpit.
Of course, there was pushback because of, cultural norms at the time, and people that really didn't believe it was, a functional uh, thing, and concerns with logistical things at the time. You have to recall, in World War II, the only women allowed to serve in the military then were like nurses. And that's before they had formed all the other women's auxiliary units that ended up being formed during World War II.
Well, 2 ladies thought differently. Their names were Nancy Love and Jacqueline Cochran. But their ideas would clash and eventually merge into the WASPs. Now, Nancy didn't just stumble into aviation. She was practically born for it. Born in Michigan in 1914, she took her first flying lesson when she was just 16 years old. And by the time she was 18, she had her pilot's license. While most girls her age were dreaming about their next dance or fancy dresses, Nancy was dreaming about altitude and airspeed. During 1942, Nancy went straight to the brass with an idea. A squadron made up of experienced female pilots, women who already had hundreds, even thousands of flight hours under their belts. No need for extra training, no need to prove themselves. They were already ready.
Nancy Love, she had the vision of taking some already highly experienced pilots. She ended up inviting, 30 pilots, 28 of which did complete the training, and that was with the formation Women's Ferrying Auxiliary Squadron, right? So, and she envisioned just taking these pilots with minimal training and getting them right out into the field, being able to help move these aircraft around.
Well, the Army Air Transport Command liked what they heard, and just like that, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WASP, was born. With Nancy Love at the helm, she personally selected the first 28 women to join, and these ladies got straight to work, ferrying planes across the country to keep America's war machine moving. Now, Jacqueline Cochran, she was a firecracker through and through. Born down in Florida, she worked her way up to be one of the fastest, most skilled pilots around. And in 1942, she also had an idea that shook things up. But unlike Nancy, she wanted to make a squadron of only female pilots.
As opposed to Jackie Cochran, who envisioned a different kind of thing, a women's only unit where it was a women's only squadron and women's only training, and where she mass produced a large amount of female pilots that then could be used in all these various roles and ferrying the aircraft. And so and both of them intended for the women to be militarized, but just not necessarily in the same way. Nancy Love's vision was more individually to be accepted in, whereas Jackie Cochran was looking to have the whole organization, maintained as a female only.
Now here's where it gets interesting. In 1943, the military decided to combine the WAFs and Cochran's Women's Flying Training Detachment, WFTD, into one unified group. The WASP, Cochran took over the whole program. Nancy Love remained in charge of ferrying operations, and under her leadership, these women flew everything. Now, don't go thinking this was some easy gig. These women had to prove themselves every single day.
Number one, being a test pilot. Anytime you pick up a brand new aircraft that's not a proven aircraft, at least like the squadrons that are out overseas in combat, it's a proven airplane. It's a plane that's been out and about that long. You pick up an airplane from the factory, you're the first one to fly it, right? So that makes them a test pilot too. So that adds an element of danger.
When the first groups of WASPs stepped up, they weren't just hopping in little puddle jumpers. They were training to fly everything from fighters to bombers, learning military protocols and taking on some of the toughest flying jobs in the service.
But some of the missions the male pilots didn't really enjoy doing were towing the banners when they were having new gunneries, trainees that were trying to learn how to do the anti-aircraft fire. And so it was live ammunition that they were using. So some of the WASP, they volunteered to do that because the male pilots weren't hip on that duty. And, they'd get their tail shot up or get, bullets in their aircraft. And so it was dangerous.
By 1943, the first batch of these lady pilots had finished their rigorous training, and they were ready to take to the skies. Their job was simple, but it sure wasn't easy. Ferry new planes to the military bases, test out aircraft before they were sent to combat, and even train the male pilots how to fly.
They basically did every single mission that male pilots did except for combat. They actually delivered like 3/5 of all aircraft built. I mean, because they were really ramping up and making all these aircraft.
They did it all, and they did it well. But here's the kicker. They weren't officially part of the military. Nope. These women were volunteers, meaning they didn't get military pay, benefits, or even recognition. And when things got dangerous, and trust me, they did, there weren't no honors or folded flags waiting for them. They took the risks without expecting a thing in return.
There wasn't a law prohibiting women, and there was a law that allowed them to take a civilian pilot that wanted to enlist and then bring them on for 90 days and then commission them as a second lieutenant in the military. So they thought initially they could bring them on that way. But then when they went to try and use that, the military, and the actual verbiage, I believe, of the rule was a person. But the Army chose to interpret that as a male. It didn't say male or female, it said a person. So evidently females weren't a person back then. And so that, because of that interpretation, they determined it was going to take an act of Congress to get the man, and an act of Congress was going to take a long time, and they had the need of them right away. So in order to expedite getting the men, they went ahead and proceeded with the intention of, militarizing them later on. But it was due to that rule of the way they interpreted a person as being male that kept them out, initially.
The numbers don't lie, folks. Over 1,000 women served as WASP pilots, flying more than 60 million miles. That's a whole lot of sky, no matter what way you look at it.
The numbers would show that they flew over 60 million miles, and they moved over 12,652 aircraft during that time.
Now, imagine this. You are a woman walking into a hangar full of men who think you don't belong. They are watching you, doubting you, waiting for you to mess up. But instead of backing down, you strap in, fire up that engine, and prove them wrong. That's exactly what these brave women did. They flew in every condition imaginable. Rain, wind, heat, and even mechanical death traps nobody else wanted to touch. And they did it with grit, determination, and a little bit of sass. 'Cause y'all know a southern woman ain't gonna back down from a challenge.
And, the male pilots would check out in one particular kind of airplane and fly that. But just think of these female pilots. They actually operated 77 different types of aircraft, right? And the average WASP ended up flying 10 to 12 different kinds of plane. So they might, jump in one plane, to another. One might be a single engine, one might be twin engine.
Now let's talk about what these women were flying. These weren't little trainer planes or Sunday cruisers. These were some of the most powerful machines in the war.
I'm reminded of the B-29 Super Fortress, right? Because that ended up being a critically important aircraft of the era. Well, it turns out that Paul Tibbets had a problem, right? Because the airplane was notorious for having these engine fires. And the male pilots had started refusing to fly the airplane and really pushing back on the airplane. And obviously they were trying to develop it to get ready for its ultimate mission. And they were running into a lot of trouble. So strategically, they came up with the idea to get two of the WASP, and they recruited Dora Doherty and Dee Mormon. And so they trained them for 3 days. Now, these women had never flown a four-engine aircraft, right? So they got 3 whole days worth of training. And after that, Tibbets declared that they were ready, and he took them out in New Mexico, and they picked up the various pilots, crew chiefs, navigators, and did a tour around, and they were showing off the aircraft and showing the proper way to operate the aircraft, because part of the reason they were having those engine fires were because they were doing static run up on the runway before departure, and they determined that the way the airflows in those engines were made and the cowlings were, it was better to do a running takeoff and not do the stationary takeoff. And so basically they had some strategies on how to operate the aircraft. And so they had done that for a few days and it was being very successful. And then all of a sudden they got a call from one of the generals, General Giles, I believe it was, and he stepped in saying that they had to shut it down, that this wasn't going well at all, and they were putting the big football players to shame, right? But Tibbets accomplished what he wanted to because after the men saw the women flying it, none of the men complained about flying the V-29 after that. And then they were able to continue, and obviously it played a pivotal role, in the end of the war for sure. Yeah.
The B-17 Flying Fortress. This was one of the biggest, baddest bombers of World War II. With 4 engines and a 4,000-pound payload, this thing wasn't exactly built for a smooth Sunday ride. But the WASP flew him, ferried him, and helped train the men who took him into combat. Then we got the well-known P-51 Mustang, one of the fastest and sharpest fighter planes ever built. The WASP flew these beauties from factory to front line, making sure they were ready to take our friendly bombers into Germany. And we can't forget the C-47 Skytrain, the P-38 Lightning, and even the mighty B-25 Mitchell bomber. These women flew them all. They weren't just ferry pilots, they were pioneers. Now, y'all, this story ain't all blue skies and tailwinds. These women had to fight for everything they got. The men in charge didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat, and a whole lot of folks believed women weren't cut out for military flight duty. But the WASP didn't back down. They kept flying, kept proving themselves, and kept doing their duty. And yet, they still didn't get the recognition they deserved. In 1944, the WASP program was quietly shut down, and the women were sent home without so much as a thank you. No military status, no benefits, a whole lot of nothing for the sacrifice they have given.
Oh, it was horrific for them. It was horrific because, their passion was flying. They were patriotic. They loved what they were doing, and the need was still there. So they were very shocked. They'd been promised that they were going to be militarized since they joined. They took a military oath when they joined, and they were on orders, and they had discharge papers, DD 214, right? They felt very, betrayed, and it was unfortunate. Unfortunate. And then it was also hard for them because they knew, like the day that they were disbanded, they still had like 66 P-51s sitting on the ramp, that needed to get ferried, and they didn't have enough male pilots to do that. So it was a shock for them. They didn't see it coming. They had a little warning that they didn't really see it coming, and they were glad that the last 2 classes were allowed to finish, even though they knew the program was winding down.
And here's the real shame of it. It took until 1977, more than 30 years later, before they were finally recognized as veterans. 30 years, y'all. That's a long time to wait for a little bit of credit. These women were in their 50s by the time they became war veterans. Even though the WASP program ended, these women changed history. They opened doors for female pilots, astronauts, and anyone else who dared to dream of the skies. Without the WASP, we might not have seen women fly in combat, command flight squadrons, or even travel into space. Women like Sally Ride, America's first female astronaut, or pioneers like Bessie Coleman, the first African-American woman to earn a pilot's license, all followed the path these women helped pave all those years ago. And it wasn't just in aviation. Women across the board, whether they were building planes, working in factories, or serving as nurses, all played a crucial role in winning the war. The WASP were just one part of a much bigger story. So, next time you see a female pilot, or hear about the female astronaut, or watch a movie with a tough as nails heroine, just remember the WASP. They were the Trailblazers, the ones who took to the skies when nobody thought they could. They weren't looking for glory, they just wanted to serve. And serve they did. So here's to the WASP, to their bravery, their sacrifice, and the way they changed the world forever. If y'all enjoyed this video and want to hear more forgotten history, check out the playlist linked down below. And if you don't want to be forgotten when the next video drops, hit that subscribe button and ring that bell so you don't miss out. If you know a story that deserves to be remembered, drop it in the comments. I just might cover it next time. This is Perhaps Mayfield signing off. See y'all in the next flight.